I would like to welcome you here on behalf of Humanities Montana. I am Kathleen Ralph. I'm the chair of Humanities Montana, and I live in Columbus, so I just drove up this morning to attend one of my favorite events of the year. We are delighted to have you all here for the 11th Annual Humanities Montana Festival of the Book. Fiction gives a writer a license to invent, but what about the things a novelist can't make up? Things that have to smell and feel real and have to be right. We've got 5 accomplished novelists with us to talk about integrating fact with fiction. And we've got Robert Stubblefield, who teaches creative writing and composition at the University of Montana, to lead the discussion. Robert himself has published fiction and personal essays in Dreamers and Desperados, contemporary short fiction of the American West, Hayden's Fairy Review, and High Desert Journal, among others. Please welcome Robert Stubblefield, who will introduce our panel.
Well, I'll go down to my right and introduce these gentlemen in order, starting with Rick DeMarinis. Rick has published 9 novels, 6 story collections, and a book on the art and craft of the short story. His newest novel, just being published, is Mama's Boy. Magazine publications include the Paris Review, among others. Rick has taught fiction writing at several universities, including San Diego State, Arizona State, the University of Montana, and the University of Texas at El Paso. He has received 2 NEA fellowships and a literature award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Rick's other magazine publications, which I skipped over a little bit with the Paris Review, include the Atlantic Monthly, the Antioch Review, Esquire, GQ, Harper's, Grand Street, and Rick lives in Olympia, Washington, and we're pleased to have him joining us here today. Jim Lynch is the author of 2 novels set in Western Washington, The Highest Tide and Border Songs. The Highest Tide won the Pacific Northwest Bookseller Award and was adapted to the stage by Seattle's Book It Theater. Border Songs, his newest novel, won the Washington State Book Award for Fiction. Jim also lives in Olympia, Washington. Olympia is rich with good writers. Stan Lynde is the author of 7 novels featuring the adventures of Deputy U.S. Marshal Merlin Fanshawe, set in 1880s Montana, and he's the winner of several Western Writers of America Spur Awards and the Independent Publishers Gold Awards for Best Regional Fiction. Stan is also the award-winning and highly acclaimed creator and artist behind the classic cartoon strip Ricochet and Latigo. Stan lives in Helena. And Peter Koch and I were just talking about some of those strips outside and remembering them fondly. Benjamin Percy is the author of the novel The Wilding and 2 books of short stories, Refresh, Refresh, and The Language of Elk. His fiction and nonfiction has been read on National Public Radio, performed at Symphony Space, and published by Esquire, Outside, Men's Journal, the Paris Review, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. His honors include the Whiting Writers Award, the Plimpton Prize, the Pushcart Prize, and inclusion in Best American Short Stories. Ben teaches in the MFA program in Creative Writing and Environment at Iowa State University. Jess Walters' 5 novels include The Financial Lives of the Poets, The Zero, a finalist for the 2006 National Book Award, the 2007 Penn Center Literary Award, and the 2007 LA Times Book Prize, and the winner of the 2007 Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award. And Citizen Vents, winner of the 2005 Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Novel, and a finalist for the International Writers Thriller of the Year Award. He lives in Spokane, Washington. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be here this afternoon and to be able to introduce these gentlemen and their work to you. And I think as we start, it's worth considering why do we turn to stories, to novels? I think it's likely for the same reasons that humans have always craved stories. As Horace said, to be instructed and delighted. And the delight is evident, but the instruction shines through the best books of our times or any time. If you want to learn what people in 19th century France feared, loathed, and loved, you could do worse than to consult Flaubert. If you seek to learn and consider the past, present, and coming concerns, pleasures and perils of the people inhabiting and passing through Butte, Bend, Biloxi, and Blaine, you best avoid Wikipedia and pick up the novels by these panelists. How do writers convince us? If the world they build is properly constructed, they can easily convince us a door below a kitchen sink is a portal to the underworld, or that monsters real and imagined inhabit the Ochakos. Two possible pitfalls of research and getting it right while you make it up can be that if you tell me it's 20 miles between Missoula and Lolo, or that Frenchtown lies west of Tarkio, there's a chance you might have lost me or any other reader forever. That's the getting it right part. Beyond that, I know that some of these gentlemen teach in creative writing programs and summer conferences, and I think we've all encountered the talented writers with stories to tell, and then they tell us that they've been dutifully performing their research for the past 14 years, and they're almost ready to start writing the book. So I think those are two things that any novelist, any writer needs to watch out for. That you don't kick the writer out of the dream, the fictional dream, and that you don't bog yourself down in research until you are unable to tell the story or unwilling to or fear it. And Bruce Springsteen says that writing is an equal exercise in faith and doubt. And I'm going to turn it over to these gentlemen, and they're going to have a conversation on how we sustain the faith and overcome our doubts, how we get it right while we make it up. And so I'll just go down in order and have them open up the conversation, and we'll talk for a while, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end. So, Rick, how do you get it right while you make it up?
I don't care much about facts. I mean, they're interesting enough, and of course you can't do stupid things like putting George Armstrong and Custer on the shores of Iwo Jima. You know, that doesn't convince anyone. But as far as getting things factually correct, the exact distance between Lolo and Frenchtown or whatever, I don't much care about that. If I say it's 10 miles or 12 miles or 30 miles, I'll let it go at that. What you don't want to do is lose the reader. You don't want the reader to throw the book down and say, this is BS. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I did that once with a rather famous writer's book, and the book was supposed to take place in Central America, and it was kind of a thriller. And but by page 20 or 30, I didn't believe it was taking place in Central America. I didn't think it was taking place anywhere. It was a kind of a fake backdrop for the action. But I wasn't supposed to believe that. Reading the book, I was supposed to believe it was taking place in Central America. Maybe some of you know this now.
I think it's one of mine.
No. And, by the time I got about 3/4 of the way through the book, I just chucked it. I just tossed it in one of the bedrooms. I can't read this. I don't believe it. But there are writers who are so good they can make you believe anything. They can, as Robert suggested, the cupboard underneath the kitchen sink leads to a fantasy world. Sure, why not? The whole trick is making the reader suspend his or her disbelief. And once you got that going, you got a good story going, and you pretty much are okay. You're okay. You pass. You may not sell any books, but you pass.
For me, I was a journalist for many years, and so, am I gone? As I was starting to say, I was a journalist for many years, and so for me, it's kind of when in doubt, I research. And so even when I'm writing novels and even tall tales, which I like to tell, I get obsessed with an area of interest and I go into great detail on it, and then realizing that I'm only going to be able to use a portion of it, but I still like to have all that research for my own edification to help make what I'm writing feel real. And so, for example, my first novel that I got published called The Highest Tide is set out in the marine flats of Puget Sound. And so I spent all kinds of time at all hours of the day out there jotting down precisely all the creatures I saw, and I interviewed marine biologists who'd seen far more than I will ever see. And so I kind of took the greatest hits of all of my work and gathered it together and sprinkled it through this very tall tale. But I do all this because it does have to feel real for me before I can try to convince you that it's real. And what I find, though, is that there's a real interesting side of being a novelist instead of being a journalist. When you're a journalist and you're asking people questions, they can get very closed-mouthed, and you have to develop this rapport before they actually open up. And so in my second novel, I was writing up about the Border Patrol and the patrols up there along the Canadian line. And when I was a journalist, they would barely tell me anything. But when I came back as a novelist, they just instantly opened up and started telling me all these elaborate stories, and I kind of started to feel like they were auditioning for roles in their mind. And so I just find that ultimately a novel has to be a work of the imagination, but that it just gets a whole lot richer for me and hopefully for the reader if I do enough work on the different subject areas that I'm passing through in the book, that it gets all that much more enjoyable.
Not sure this is on either. Not yet. Yeah, I really agree with that. I try to, in my books, I try to put the reader into the situation. I think many people want to do that. I think with thrillers especially, this is a place where the reader wants to be there with the protagonist and experience that with them. And I too recognize that you can certainly get lost in research and take it too far. I'm a great fan of Elmore Leonard's work, and he's one who began his career with stories of the Apache wars in the Southwest. And much of his research at that time was done simply by reading Arizona highways. He would describe the pictures he found in Arizona highways, and that was his description of the terrain. And those books are very, very readable and his stories are very gritty but I feel like I'm there. I feel like I've been in this situation with him. My latest book takes place in Butte in 1888, and it is a story featuring the possible assassination of Marcus Daly, and my protagonist has got to find and prevent that. So mainly it was a matter of learning what Butte was like at that particular time, and going back to Butte several times and experiencing and imagining it. And if you imagine it enough and you can communicate that, then you really have this dance with your reader that they'll buy it. And as Rick said, they suspend disbelief, and for the benefit of us both and for the joy of the story.
I consider every short story a research project, every novel a research project, and I find myself oftentimes framing the question of research around a job. So, the job not only has to do with the point of view of the story, bending the world around the position that my character has. Like if you think of the character as let's say a piano mover. There's a great Kevin McElvoy story called The People Who Own Pianos that I sometimes use as an example in class. And how does the piano mover see the world as a series of tight hallways and narrow staircases? And how does the piano mover see the world? They see it as divided by class. Those who have pianos and those who don't. So it has to do with that, but it also has to do with the credibility that comes from immersing yourself in that world. So if I'm writing about, say, a taxidermist, I go to a few studios and I finger the glass eyeballs and run my hands along the polyurethane forms, and I pick up the language, because every job has its own language, its own lingo, its own terminology. And I interview the people who work there, and I pick up a series of articles available through the electronic database at my university, and I pick up some books, and I almost always have at the center of every story somebody who has some unique profession, whether that's somebody who works in a foundry. I wrote a story about a guy who works in a foundry, working all day in the darkness, smashing a sledgehammer against hot metal. People who are in the service, people who work as loggers or who work in mills. And for me, there's great pleasure in that, because and maybe it comes from some of the work I've done in nonfiction, and even some of the work I've done in fiction, because I've worked extensively with the Paris Review, and Philip Grayevich, who was at the helm of it then, he fact-checked all fiction that he published. And so, I was sort of trained in that mode. And you're able to live many lives when you spend weeks, sometimes months, in other people's offices, in other people's lives. And the hope is, of course, that if somebody who is in the service picks up your novel, or somebody who has worked as a taxidermist picks up your short story, they're gonna say, yeah, this guy got it right. And that's my aim. And I think that people are looking to catch you. Like, readers are they get great pleasure, this sort of sick pleasure out of catching you. And Brady Udall warned me about this once. He said that 70% of the fan mail you get will be like, this was great, but there's not a tree at that intersection. It's very true. So you got to cover your bases.
Is this on? Yeah, I get sort of suspicious now about the research and fiction question, because my last novel is about a middle-aged guy who gets high for the first time in 15 years. So people usually say, I have two questions. What research did you do? Can you give me some? In general, I agree with everything that was said here. There is that idea that you're trying to get the reader to willfully suspend disbelief. But as they also said, for the writer, that's just as important. Any wannabe writer, is this going on and off? Sounds like it's cutting in and out. Any writer, sorry. Any writer knows that feeling of when the bubble just bursts, when you're writing and all of a sudden you just don't believe it anymore. And so the other disbelief I'm constantly trying to willfully suspend is my own. I'm constantly trying to convince myself that I know this world. So I love that sense of immersion. I love going someplace. One of my novels was set in New York in 1980, and there was nothing better than to print out a 1980 New York subway map. And I had a book of photos of New York from 1980, and just to sort of soak up the smells and the feels. So that kind of immersion, and then balanced with the sort of research that as journalists we do. I also have a journalist background. Really frees you, I think, to write. And the other thing is you aren't writing necessarily how the world is, but how it could be. And so it's a great measure of saying, well, there may not be a tree at this corner, but if there were and a car hit it, this is what would happen. So for me, that's incredibly freeing, and one of the best parts is knowing what the world looks like enough that I can completely ignore that and invent it in my own manner.
Well, one thing that I admire about all of your work, and it's something that Ben brought up prominently in his comments, is that people lead lives and they do work. And it seems like in a lot of contemporary fiction, people feel a lot, they smoke a lot of cigarettes, they drive around a lot, but there's a lack of work in there. And as I see some of my students in the room, and they know that I've always talked to them about the importance of incorporating work in fiction, because work or lack of work leads to some of the biggest conflicts in our lives. And fiction is about conflict, ultimately, and the human experience. And I think when characters do work, when the protagonist is working, it adds texture and it gives you the opportunity to add some of the components that they've talked about. And I just wonder if you would elaborate on that a little bit. I mean, in Jim's latest novel, the protagonist is a border crossing guard and
Yeah, he's
border
a
patrol.
Border Patrol agent. But I did a lot of occupational studying for that novel. I also hung out on a dairy farm for a week because there's so much dairy farming up there. And I really thought that was going to be, kind of a punishment that I had to hang out on the dairy farm to understand how it's done. But the more I was there, the more I realized how much drama was actually inherent in a small dairy farm, family-run dairy farm, where you have to milk the cows twice a day, 7 days a week until you sell or die. And then I also have some professional marijuana smugglers in this novel because it's up on the border. I have to have smugglers. And talking to those people was interesting in its own way, and finding a website where there's smuggling tips on exactly what, that marijuana has similar consistency to raspberries, and so you pack it in the middle of raspberries, and there are all these tips that get exchanged, all of which just kind of adds richness to the work, I think.
I think we're talking about knowing what you're talking about, and a lot of young writers often don't know what they're talking about, even though they're talented. I remember teaching a workshop once here in Montana years ago, and a young man wrote a story about an alcoholic. He was a pretty good writer, and it was pretty convincing. But this alcoholic, had a job, and he was functioning pretty well, but he was really putting away the booze, like a quart a day, by himself in a darkened room someplace. And after we talked about the story a while, I said, tell me, Frank, I don't know what his name was. Tell me, Frank, how did this guy deal with blackouts? And he said, what's a blackout? I mean, come on, you got to know something about what you're writing about. I feel uncomfortable writing unless the locale is a place I'm very familiar with. My first novel, second novel published, but my very first novel was about the aerospace industry, about a character who was working for a large aerospace firm. Well, I worked for Boeing for a couple of years and Lockheed for another year, so I knew what it was about. I knew what those places look like, what they smell like, and what the people feel when they're working in places like that. So I've hesitated to write a book like that unless I knew something about the place itself. And I continue to do that. My last novel, my present novel that's for sale out there someplace, takes place at an Air Force base, a radar station in northern Montana, and lo and behold, I was there. I was stationed at north of Havre at a radar station, so I kind of knew what it was about. So, and I find that necessary. I can't. I'm not a good researcher. I'm too. I don't know. I guess I get bored or something with looking up facts and talking to people. I don't want to do it. I want to have been there myself. So that's my take on it.
There's that the old saw, write what you know, and the great thing about, the one thing that I think is great for journalists who come to fiction is that you sort of invert that and you decide to know what you write. And so I love to go somewhere and just sit under cover and listen to conversations and try to pick up the way the dialogue and that specific terminology. And I think almost all of my best notes are on the backs of cocktail napkins. So as I'm doing research into blackouts. So.
Well, I think something that Stan mentioned too, I'd like to have him elaborate a little bit more on, because Elmore Leonard started out writing in the Western genre, wrote very convincingly. The film 3:10 to Yuma was based on a short story of his, and then he's moved from that to write about urban settings very convincingly, which I assume he knows, and now Somalian pirates. And how do you think, I think when we're talking about writing what you know, one of the fears that people have is they'll run out of that. But writing leads to writing, and sometimes you can write what you want to know, I think.
That's true. Yeah, I think I find that one of the reasons I do westerns is that that rule of writing what you know. But in the end, you can't really know it all, and there's some shortcuts that young writers, I think, would find useful. One of those is not to worry about all the details as you're writing, but go back afterward, after a first draft, and pick up those places. One of those, I read an article once about the concept of, say your character is taking a small speedboat out from the French Riviera to a yacht. Well, you don't have to know all of that. You simply can say that he's done this, and then go back and pick up enough small detail to convince people that that's what he's doing. And you can get your view of the Riviera, what's happening there, from travel magazines. You can learn how you have to cast off the lines to get the speedboat started and take it off from there. Those things can be added later, and there's just enough detail to carry your narrative. And so you don't have to know everything, but I think writing what you know, and sometimes writing what you love, and observing people. I think that's a great comment that has been made, that people that you know and occupations, and there's a pattern. And again, Elmore Leonard now in his books is a master of conversation between some of the underworld types that he portrays. And I haven't read the Somalian books yet, but he's excellent at that. Always was.
Well, when we talk about the balance of that, too, I think, how do you keep yourself interested in a book as you're moving along? And it seems to me what we're addressing is it isn't necessarily a linear process that you imagine a book, you research it, and then you write it. I think you write and research enough to keep yourself interested and convinced, and then go back and see what you have to know. Would you agree with that, or is that how you work? Or?
That's right. Doing westerns, you don't have to. It helps to know that how you saddle a horse, how long it takes you to ride from here to there, those facts. But then to drop in enough of that so that your reader is convinced, and it doesn't take much. If you're telling a good story, they're willing to go with you on very little, and their own imagination that they bring to it is an important thing. Sort of like the old days of radio drama. My son, when he was small, asked me what those old radio shows were like, and I said they were just like TV, but you didn't have to watch them. and that's really true. I think the listener brings much to those old shows, and they were scarier than anything I've read for a long time, or seen in movies. I mean, even though they're very explicit. And so good fiction, I think, is that way, and the part that readers bring to it. And if you're passionate enough about it and telling a story that you love, you're going to attract the readers, and they're going to go with you too.
One of the problems I've seen in people who are a little too passionate about their subject matter is that they research the hell out of it to the point that they forget about the story, and all of this research is compiled and plugged into the narrative, and it ends up clogging up the gears. It ends up destroying momentum. Robert Olmsted told me that it took him about 6 years to write Coal Black Horse, which is a great Civil War novel, if you haven't picked it up. And then he said it took him another 4 years to unwrite it. and you go through all these books on whatever your subject matter is, and you're dog-earing pages, and you're highlighting endlessly, and you've got files and files of notes, and it becomes sometimes staggering. I know that James Michener used to read like 150 books on the subject and not take any notes. He'd just soak it all up, and then after he's done with those 150 books, he'd just start writing. So there's one approach. Other people are immersive as they go along, and some people it's more after the fact. So I don't think there's any one right way. I heard one writer on a panel say When it comes to historical fiction, the best route you can take is just look at newspapers and magazines from the time, not for the articles that appear in them, but instead looking at the advertisements. So you know what kind of coats people were wearing, vacuum cleaners that were on sale, the music that was playing over the radio, that kind of thing. That the ambient details are the most important.
Well, how do you think the editing process plays into that? Because I think we've all read a novel where the research comes to the forefront and clogs up the gears, as you say. As readers, that's immediately evident to us. But I think as writers, sometimes it's easy to become enamored in those details, those things that we're interested in. And I think we also try to do, as you were saying, what Brady warned us about. People want to be bulletproof, so nobody can call them on something being wrong. So how do you maintain that balance?
Jess.
And how might editors help you with that? The
What
editing
is this
process.
editing you speak of? Boy, it's for me personally, I read everything out loud, and pace and voice are the most important things to me in the end. And so I can often tell when I'm getting bored. That's when I fall asleep, or and you quoted Elmore Leonard, who has that great, who developed his style by going back and realizing there were great parts of books that he kept skipping over, long periods of description. I love some of that description, so I don't skip over all of it, but I always assume that if Elmore Leonard reads one of my books, that he won't skip over very much. So I find myself often applying that test to it as I read. But that's typically how I do it. And once I know, you look at the beginning of, say, A Farewell to Arms by Hemingway, and there's not a specific detail in it. It's just there was a road, the soldiers marched down the road, dust came off the road, they were in a house. There is no research in it, and yet does it feel like possibly someone who might have known what war was like? It isn't necessarily in the details, and that's why I think sometimes that research is more important to the writer than it is to those readers looking through. I don't think publishing houses vet anything like magazines do. So you're not going to have an editor saying, I tried the Cabernet from that winery you suggested, and it's actually more oaky than you say. So it's really going to be incumbent upon you to believe the world that you create. And I freely put parking lots where they don't exist, move houses around, and when people complain, I just write and say it's fiction here. So if I believe it, then if it reads well to me out loud, then it's usually past the only tests along those lines it's going to get.
Yeah, I think that's a great test for it. If it sounds pedantic, it probably is.
Right.
And I think that's a great tip that Elmore Leonard has. I try to leave out the parts people skip.
Just one comment along those lines, though. I find that if you do want to get things into your fiction that you think will enrich the whole story, you just have to be strategic about where you put them a lot of the time. And I find that a lot of beginning writers that want to pour information into their fiction don't really know where to place it, and that they're placing it, a digression after a digression, and so you don't want to digress into potentially boring terrain unless you have reader momentum at a real high. And so I always go through my fiction, and I'm constantly looking to see the reader momentum roller coaster, and just trying to get a feel for where it's at before I risk boring them.
Well, and I think that shows in your work, Jim. When you read Border Songs, you feel like you are on a dairy farm rather than learning about a dairy farm. And I think that's what any writer hopes to do. So, anything else from the panelists here? And we'll go ahead and open it up for questions, because I know some of you will have some questions for them. Anything you want to say before we? Okay, questions. There's one right here in front.
How does the approach creating characters who are other than like you, say a black man, black woman, a woman, a child, an uneducated person?
Well, they're human beings. for one thing. You don't have to do a lot of research, and if you've lived a life of knowing people and various kinds, you've got a pretty good idea of how to handle them in fiction, I think. I think it's a poor writer who can't do that, who makes you disbelieve that you have ever seen a black man or a black woman or anything, or a kangaroo or whatever. It's in the writing, and it's in your depth of understanding, I think.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes like being an actor, you know, finding some emotional point to connect with those characters. And, you know, I have a character who's nothing like me, but at one point spouts one of my insecurities so completely that it's a little horrifying when I go back and read it, you know. And this guy is, you know, he's the character couldn't be further from me. But again, it's one of, as Rick says, one of those, you know, human moments that that, you know, anyone can connect with. Grief, love, you know, those things can be universal, no matter what your background, you know. And then then for me, I'll often, almost like an actor, I'll try to build a character one piece at a time. With you know, actors are famous for starting with a hat. You know, as soon as I got that hat, I knew what the character was like. And for me, it can be more like an obsession. You know, knowing that I've got someone whose interest is architecture, I start to look at the world the way they do in that way, or you know, knowing that someone that's lost their job, you know, it's just an act of compassion, I guess, to imagine yourself in that position, or to have been in that position, you know, which many of us have.
Yeah, I think, again, the actor simile is a good one. Actors often are talking about what is my motivation, and I try to give even my secondary characters, I try to understand what their motivation is. And I think when you're dealing with minorities or the opposite sex, or people that, you know, older people, younger people, if you understand what their motivation is, what their direction, what their life is like, and what they hope, if their hopes are realized or not, it all springs from that. And I think those people then become believable, and the gender or the race or nationality, none of that matters that much anymore.
I have a question that concerns kind of the accuracy of your setting, your backdrop. I'm working on a project where I have my one of the characters in the climax of the story leaps out a third-story window of a house that's next to a river. Now, this is a real river that exists, and I wrote the story, and I went to research it. I found out the river is 2 feet deep. So now I have this dilemma: do I change the climax, or do I make the river deeper?
Deep in the river.
That's it. I'd break the character's leg. Trust me, you can survive a 3-story fall. It's not that bad.
Have you researched it?
I'm a very dialogue-driven writer, so as other writers yourself, how do you find the best techniques to research and write, make your dialogue sound real to a reader?
I think in doing historical work, a lot of people get caught up in that and try to have people. You can't go back to Elizabethan England and have people speak exactly as they did then, because then you become sort of an imitation Shakespeare, which is not what you want. I think if you listen to people, listen to conversation, and I love to do that. I think a lot of us do. I love to go to airports and watch people and imagine who they are as they walk around, and just listen to conversation. Some of the best conversations have been done by writers like Hemingway. The amazing short story Hills Like Gray Elephants, is it? White Elephants, is classic. It's all about the subject of their conversation is never mentioned, but it's completely understood. And it's that kind of listening I think that helps do dialogue.
I think that every character needs to sound completely unique, and I use sometimes clips in class, media clips, including some from The Sopranos. And if you look at The Sopranos, you might think, all right, they all sound the same. You know, they're all Italian, New Jersey mobsters who, are operating in a morally gray territory. But each one of them is totally specific in the way that they speak. Tony is always ordering somebody to do something or interrogating somebody. Junior is always whining or confused. Christopher always feels put upon. Everything that comes out of his mouth is defensive, or he's twisting the conversation. And if you look at something like that and realize that how unique all of these guys who are essentially clumped into the same category are, that has to be true of every character that you put on the page. So, you have to think about like how much visual space does this one character take up on the page in terms of the, do they have these long strips of dialogue compared to the sort of abbreviated, clipped responses of the other character in the scene? Does this person use an abundance of cliches? Do they have a kind of free associative mind where they're jumping from topic to topic and in their digression finally find their way back to where the conversation began? Conversations also, they always have to have, there always has to be something at work there in terms of conflict. One character wants one thing, one other character wants another thing. And they're trying to pry, something from each other. And characters don't listen to each other. One will say one thing and the other will have misperceived it or won't have listened, and on it goes. And that, I think dialogue is one of the hardest things to pull off. And ideally, when the day is done, you won't be able to take one character's speech and put it in another character's mouth. It won't taste right there.
And if you do that right, then you'll get to the place where on a page you won't have to have George said or Henry said. You'll know by listening that it's George or Henry.
Just one point on that. As far as listening to people talk, when you do listen to them, you'll often find that it isn't a question and answer usually. I mean, in prose, it often shows up that way, but quite often people are talking about two different things, and especially if you have, for example, couples that have been together for a long time, they can be talking, on totally different channels, and also you'll see people that they'll have conversations and they'll both be talking simultaneously. I mean, it's mayhem, and I think that too often when we sit down to write dialogue, it's all complete sentences and it's Q&A, and I think it's really that it takes away from the realism.
I think Jim's exactly right. I think the other danger is trying to get your dialogue to do too much work then. This is the scene where they've got to get all this information across, and often that's not how it works. That's not the way our conversations are. So if I can be dialogue heavy too, and I have to sometimes go back and make sure I'm not trying to get the dialogue to do more work than conversations generally provide.
Well, I think that comes back to something that we were talking about too with work and how people see the world. Because like the piano mover, the way they see the world, and if you can imagine those characters, I think how we look at things metaphorically is among the most idiosyncratic qualities that we have. And if you can distinguish between characters, don't you think that helps?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, I'm talking directly to you, Rick.
Well, dialogue is a great opportunity to exercise your art, I think. I feel, I'm pretty old, but I'm still learning my craft. And I think most writers will say that they are still learning their craft. If you read a Hemingway short story and you want to look closely at the dialogue, you'll learn something about how to write dialogue. Elmore Leonard, same thing, brilliant dialogue writer. But it's not easy. And they're doing things that are subtle and that I feel I can learn from. I remember a student's story. A woman in the story says something like to her husband, "Oh, how did your work go today at A and B packing plant?" Well, she knows that's where he works. I mean. But there she's giving information, the writer's giving information to the reader that this character works at the A and B packing plant, not the C and D packing plant. So, yeah, and you know, James Lee Burke is another one. His dialogue writing is dazzling, and I admit I have learned from him and I've stolen a little bit from him on how to do it. So, so what?
Thanks. Yes.
As all male authors, when it comes to dialogue and character, is it difficult then to put yourself or to be able to develop the female?
Sure.
Don't say that.
Not to say it can't be done, but you...
Sounds like, I mean, yes, a woman would think this, or, I mean, you get that sense. And sometimes I'm really amazed at male authors that are able to do this, and then others that don't seem to be able to do it.
Well, I think you have to call on the female side of your personality, and sometimes some writers feel that's kind of a threatening thing to do. And I think if Hemingway has any flaw in his dialogue is with women characters. They're a little bit too manly, I think. And maybe in his case he was, you know, a little bit shy of doing that. But I think you've got to face that and dig into your own psyche to do that. I mean, as writers, we're neither male or female. We're these creatures who create stories, and we want to create the best stories possible. And to do that, we have to pay very close attention to how people think, regardless of, and how they speak, regardless of their sex. It's difficult, though. Not easy.
I know we're all men up here, but we don't live in an isolated world of just men. I mean, we're surrounded by women all the time. We're interacting with women and girls, and so it's not as difficult as you might imagine. I also just don't. I think, you know, there's obvious differences between men and women, but there's some fundamental similarities that make it an easy bridge to cross, I find.
Got a question
Or I
right
claim.
here and then over here.
So I was just curious, as a group of prolific and successful authors, what are the genesis moments for your stories, for each of you? Where do they often begin? Is there a theme from one project to another that spark that becomes the novel?
Guilt for not writing, boredom for being, you know, stuck with myself, which is, I figure, is a very boring self. But I'm excited about things when I'm writing. But it takes work. Yeah. Laziness plays a part in it too.
You know, I feel like my biggest fear is I won't have time to get to all the things that are out there. You know, I feel like a really busy air traffic controller sometimes, you know, and I bring in as many of the planes as I can, but I have more, and I never throw anything away. I have, and I've used this analogy before, but it's like being a magpie. You're constantly flying around looking for little bits of garbage to take back to make your nest out of. And they wouldn't look like anything that would be worthwhile to anyone else, but to me, they're the great start of a conversation. Or I heard two people on an airplane once talking about, one person was selling a business to someone else and they were going to try to make it sound more profitable than it really was. And I was listening to two people cook the books on a business, and I couldn't believe it. I was just writing as quickly as I could. And I've still never found a place to put that because I know nothing about business, you know. I would have to, but I know that'll show up sometimes. So I'm constantly just collecting those scraps, always writing in a journal, always recording that stuff. And then I find when I sit at the desk and put my fingers on the home keys that those things start coming back to me. I start filing for those little scraps of paper. So yeah, I don't really, it's really hard to find a genesis moment. It feels to me like it's just this constant process. You know, about every 300 pages I send it off to the editor, but otherwise I just sort of keep going.
There was a Greyhound bus once going from Missoula to Sacramento. Takes forever because they go through Salt Lake City. But I learned how to steal successfully from Kmart on that trip. There were some thieves evidently sitting behind me talking about the method. And the method is you go in, you buy something cheap, and they put the receipt onto they tape it onto the box. Well, you take the receipt off, go back in, get an expensive item, put the tape on it, walk out with it. I don't think that really works anymore, but it worked for them. They thought it did anyway. Yeah. So I wrote that down.
At least they've gotten something useful.
We had a question right here in front.
Yes, as writers of fiction, do any of your characters ever become so real to you that they may change your own personality while you're writing the book?
And your point is?
Yeah, right.
I don't get obsessed with my characters.
I think that, you go through certain things in life, and, you fall in love or you fall out of love, you're betrayed, you grieve, you have kids, you get married, whatever. And every time something big happens, whether you're a writer or not, you push forward into that new level of consciousness, and your perspective shifts a little bit. And I think that, in a way, for me, I understand things by writing about them. I truly understand them when I write about them, because I'm forced to sit down and crystallize the moment. And so, yeah, sometimes you push through like a snake pushing through a new layer of skin when you spend 300 pages with this family you've created, and realize something about them and about yourself in the process. So I can sort of track through my fiction and see a kind of chronology to my consciousness.
I would admit that there are times when the characters I'm writing feel more real than my friends and almost my family, and there are strange points for me when I often create characters with obsessions, and so if I create a character who's a birder and I start hanging out with birders, and suddenly I'm bringing home birdhouses and putting them all around the lawn, and my daughter is asking my mother, what's with Dad? And so there's that kind of effect on my life, that I feel like I need to share their obsessions or their views and mix that into my own self to be able to write it. But then I also get the follow-up after you're actually done with a novel, and then people want to know the details of what happened next, and I have no idea what to tell them, because all I know is what I created, what I carved there.
Okay, one more question.
This question is more about kind of the editing process and any of the conflicts that you may have before, because as writers you're kind of selling it. First you're selling it to editors and publishers and things like that, the believability of what you're writing before it ever gets to us as readers. And I'm just wondering how much conflict any of you have had in that process. And I thought of that, there's this documentary / book out. It's a conversation between Gary Snyder and Jim Harrison. And there's a part in there where Jim Harrison's talking about this piece he has. There's this small town in Nebraska where this action takes place, and he says, the editor calls me and says, this town doesn't exist. And I say, well, yes, it does. She said, well, I Googled it and it's not there. And he says, well, I was there and it was there. And Snyder, kind of closes the conversation by saying, yeah, the whole world isn't in Google. And I'm kind of wondering if any of you, like if you write about a guy who works at a foundry and you put that foundry in, Ronan, Montana, and there isn't one there, how hard do you have to fight sometimes to keep some of those elements that maybe aren't 100% true, but are critical to your story, and you have to sell it past this editor who, thinks Google is the source for everything?
I'll tell you a brief story about Jim Welch. When he published his first book, Winter in the Blood, he had these guys drinking in a bar in northern Montana on the Blackfeet Reservation. And actually not the Blackfeet, it was in Havre, I think. And one orders creme de mint. And Jim wrote it that way. Well, his editor said, it's not cream de mint. It's cremes de menthe. Well, you know, a Blackfeet Indian from northern Montana is not going to say, I would like a cremes de menthe. He had a real fight. He had a real struggle with that. I think Jim got his way.
But the other side, though, is that we're in the West, so we could say anything. And Edder's in New York. You could get in your car in Missoula and be in Los Angeles 20 minutes later, and they would say, "Okay, that's fine." And just so, yeah, I haven't found too much of a problem, except on book tour when they put you in the Tri-Cities, which are any three cities that happen to be close to each other. So.
I think one of Norman Maclean's rejection slips for a river runs through it was too many trees. I mean, there are a lot of idiots in publishing, believe me.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for turning out this afternoon, and especially thank our panelists. And they will be outside in the lobby with books for sale and books to be signed. So thank all of you.